The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook, Texas, as Clara Bennett adjusted her grandmother's pearl necklace one final time. The white satin dress, carefully preserved in cedar and lavender for this very day, rustled softly as she moved toward the mirror in her childhood bedroom. Outside her window, the sprawling Bennett ranch stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its golden wheat fields swaying in the gentle September breeze of 1887. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," whispered Sarah, her childhood friend and only bridesmaid, as she fastened the last button on Clara's dress. "Thomas is the luckiest man in 3 counties." Clara smiled, but something cold settled in her stomach as she heard her father's heavy boots climbing the wooden stairs. Richard Bennett had been distant for weeks, ever since announcing his sudden engagement to Victoria Ashworth, a widow from San Antonio with connections to the railroad company. At 45, Clara had assumed her father's romantic life was behind him, especially after her mother's death 5 years earlier. Clara. Her father's voice was gruff as he appeared in the doorway, his silver mustache freshly waxed for the occasion. "We need to talk." Sarah quietly excused herself, sensing the tension that had become all too familiar in the Bennett household. Clara turned to face the man who had raised her, taught her to ride, and shown her every inch of their 10,000-acre spread. "What is it, Papa?" "The ceremony starts in an hour." Richard's weathered hands fidgeted with his black string tie. Behind him stood Victoria, resplendent in emerald silk that cost more than most families in Millbrook earned in a year. Her dark eyes held a satisfaction that made Clara's skin crawl. "There's been a change of plans," Richard said, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "Victoria and we've discussed your future, and we feel it's best if you start fresh. Somewhere else." Clara's heart began to race. "What do you mean, somewhere else? This is my wedding day. Thomas is waiting at the church. The whole town is. The whole town will understand when I explain that you're no longer part of this family," Richard interrupted, his words hitting Clara like a physical blow. "You'll take nothing from this ranch, nothing with the Bennett name. It's time you learned to stand on your own." The room spun around Clara as she gripped the edge of her vanity table. "Papa, what are you saying? This is my home. I was born here. Mama is buried here." Victoria stepped forward, her voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "Your father has made his decision, dear. The ranch needs to stay in capable hands, and frankly, a woman alone isn't suitable to manage such a vast operation. Richard and I will ensure the Bennett legacy continues properly." Clara stared at her father, searching his familiar blue eyes for any trace of the man who had braided her hair and taught her the difference between good soil and bad. "You're choosing her over your own daughter? On my wedding day?" Richard's jaw tightened, but his resolve didn't waver. "You're 23 years old, Clara. It's time you stop depending on me for everything. Thomas can provide for you elsewhere." The weight of her grandmother's silk dress suddenly felt crushing. Clara's hand instinctively moved to the hidden pocket sewn into the bodice, where a folded document rested against her ribs. She'd carried it for months, unsure of its significance, but something deep in her bones told her this moment would come. "The guests are waiting," Victoria said with false sympathy. "Perhaps it's best to cancel the ceremony entirely. Save everyone the embarrassment." Clara looked between them, feeling a strength she'd never known building in her chest. 23 years of love, of being told she was cherished, of believing she had a place in this world, all crumbling in the space of a single conversation. But underneath the devastation, something else stirred, a quiet determination that reminded her powerfully of her grandmother Elizabeth. "No," Clara said quietly, straightening her shoulders. "I won't cancel. I won't embarrass Thomas or his family. I'll go through with the ceremony and then I'll leave, but don't expect me to disappear quietly, Papa. I'm a Bennett, whether you acknowledge it or not." As she moved past them toward the door, Victoria's hand shot out to grab her wrist. "Leave the necklace. It belongs to the family." Clara looked down at the pearls that had graced 3 generations of Bennett women. Slowly, deliberately, she reached up and unclasped them, letting them drop to the floor where they scattered like tears across the hardwood. "Keep them," Clara said, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "They never belonged to you anyway." The walk to the church felt like a funeral march. Clara moved through the dusty streets of Millbrook, her white dress a beacon of defiance against the brown landscape. Neighbors and friends who had known her since birth lined the wooden sidewalks, their faces reflecting confusion and whispered concern. Word traveled fast in small towns, and the sudden change in the Bennett family dynamics would be tomorrow's scandal. Thomas Whitmore stood at the altar in his best black suit, his kind brown eyes filled with worry as Clara approached. He'd been courting her for 2 years, working as the county's deputy sheriff and saving every penny to build them a home. He didn't know about the fortune in land he'd assumed would come with marrying Richard Bennett's daughter. "Clara," he whispered as she reached his side, "what's happening? Your father looks like he's attending a funeral instead of a wedding." Clara took Thomas's hands in hers, feeling the calluses from his honest work, the steadiness that had drawn her to him in the first place. "There are things we need to discuss after the ceremony. But Thomas, I need you to know, I come to you with nothing but myself. Is that enough?" His confused smile was answer enough. "You've always been enough, Clara. More than enough." Reverend Matthews cleared his throat and began the ceremony, his voice echoing through the small wooden church packed with the entire population of Millbrook. Clara tried to focus on the words, on Thomas's face, on anything but her father's cold stare from the front pew. Victoria sat beside him like a queen claiming her throne, her satisfied smirk never wavering. "If anyone has reason these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace." The silence stretched for exactly 3 heartbeats before Richard Bennett stood up. "I object." A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Clara felt Thomas's hands tighten around hers as her father stepped into the aisle. "This woman is no daughter of mine," Richard announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "She has no claim to the Bennett name, no inheritance, no place in this family. Any man who marries her does so knowing she brings nothing to the union." The church erupted in whispers and shocked murmurs. Clara stood frozen, feeling the weight of every eye in Millbrook upon her. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, and instead it had become her public execution. Thomas stepped forward, his voice strong and clear. "I don't care about land or money, Mr. Bennett. I care about Clara." "Then you're a fool," Richard replied coldly. "But if you want her, take her. Just know that she leaves with nothing but the dress on her back." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the document in her bodice, like a beating heart. Her grandmother's voice echoed from childhood memories. "Sometimes, child, the land chooses its own keeper." When she opened her eyes again, her voice was steady as mountain stone. "Then I guess it's a good thing the dress is all I need." 3 hours later, Clara stood in the small cabin Thomas had built on the outskirts of town, still wearing her wedding dress, but no longer feeling like a bride. The simple ceremony had concluded in awkward silence, with most of the town following them to the reception out of curiosity rather than celebration. Now, as the sun set through the single window, she carefully removed the document from its hiding place and spread it across the rough wooden table. Thomas watched her with growing concern, still in his wedding suit, but with his collar loosened and sleeves rolled up. "Clara, what is that? You've been acting strange all day, even before your father's announcement." Clara smoothed the yellowed paper with trembling fingers. The elegant script was unmistakably her grandmother's, dated 15 years earlier and witnessed by the county clerk and the town doctor. As she read aloud, Thomas's face shifted from confusion to amazement to something approaching awe. "I, Elizabeth Margaret Bennett, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the entirety of the Bennett Ranch, including all lands, livestock, and structures thereon, to my granddaughter Clara Elizabeth Bennett, upon the occasion of her 23rd birthday, or her wedding day, whichever comes first." Clara's voice caught on the next line. This bequest supersedes any claims by my son Richard Bennett, who forfeited his inheritance rights through his treatment of his late wife during her final illness. Thomas sank into the chair across from her, running his hands through his sandy hair. Clara, do you understand what this means? Your grandmother left you everything. Your father, he doesn't actually own the ranch. I've been carrying this for 8 months, Clara whispered, touching the paper as if it might disappear. Grandmother gave it to me before she died, but I was only 15 and didn't understand. I found it again in her old jewelry box after Papa announced his engagement to Victoria. I think Grandmother knew this day would come. The implications settled around them like dust after a whirlwind. The Bennett Ranch was the largest spread in 3 counties, with water rights that extended to the Rio Grande and mineral rights that hadn't been fully explored. It was worth more than Thomas made in 10 lifetimes as a deputy sheriff. We need to take this to Judge Morrison, Thomas said finally. If it's legally binding, it is. Clara's voice was stronger now. Look at the witnesses. Dr. Patterson confirmed Grandmother was lucid, and County Clerk Williams filed the original with the land office in Austin. I checked before the wedding. Thomas stood and began pacing the small cabin, his boot heels echoing on the wooden floor. Your father has been running that ranch for 5 years, making decisions, selling cattle, even mortgaging portions to the railroad company. If he doesn't actually own it, then every contract he's signed is fraudulent, Clara finished. And Victoria's marriage to him won't give her any claim to property that was never his to begin with. The weight of the revelation hung between them. Clara had gone from disowned daughter to one of the wealthiest landowners in Texas in the span of a single afternoon. But more than the money or the land, she felt the presence of her grandmother's love, reaching across the years to protect her when she needed it most. Why didn't you tell me before the ceremony? Thomas asked gently. Clara looked out the window toward the distant lights of the main house where she'd grown up. Because I needed to know you'd marry me for myself, not for what I might inherit. And because, she paused, gathering courage, because I wasn't sure I was strong enough to fight for it until Papa showed me exactly who he'd become. Thomas knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. And now I think Grandmother knew exactly what she was doing when she put this in my hands. Clara's smile was sharp as a blade. Papa wants to disown me? Fine. But he's about to learn that the land has already chosen its keeper. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden light that made the Texas plains look like they stretched to eternity. Clara woke before sunrise, as was her habit from years of ranch life, and dressed carefully in her best traveling dress, deep blue wool with black trim that had belonged to her mother. She braided her dark hair simply and pinned it up with her grandmother's silver combs. Thomas had already left for his rounds as deputy sheriff, but not before kissing her goodbye and promising to be back by noon with Judge Morrison and County Clerk Williams. Clara appreciated his instinct to protect her, but this was something she needed to do herself. The walk from their cabin to the main house took 20 minutes across familiar ground. Clara knew every fence post, every watering hole, every shaded grove where she'd played as a child. The land felt different now that she understood it was truly hers, not just by birth or tradition, but by legal right and her grandmother's explicit wish. Maria Santos met her at the kitchen door, the elderly Mexican woman who had been the ranch's cook and housekeeper for 30 years. Her weathered face creased with worry as she pulled Clara into a fierce hug. Misha, what happened yesterday? The whole house is upside down. Your father, he is acting like a man possessed. And that woman... Maria's voice trailed off, but her disapproval was clear. Where are they now, Maria? In the study. They have been there since dawn, going through papers and ledgers. Your father keeps saying something about securing the assets before... She paused, glancing around as if Victoria might materialize from the shadows. Before what? I do not know. Clara nodded, understanding perfectly. Richard and Victoria were trying to transfer or hide anything of value before Clara could assert her legal claim. It was exactly what she'd expected, and exactly why she'd come alone. "Maria, I need you to listen carefully," Clara said, keeping her voice low. "In a few hours, some men are coming from town, Judge Morrison and the county clerk. Whatever happens, I need you to remember that Grandmother Elizabeth loved this land and everyone on it. Can you trust me?" Maria's dark eyes searched Clara's face for a long moment before she nodded slowly. "Your grandmother? She was a wise woman. And you have her strength. Yes, Mija, I trust you." Clara made her way through the house where she'd grown up, noting changes that Victoria had already implemented. New curtains in the parlor, expensive china in the dining room, and most tellingly, a portrait of Victoria prominently displayed where Clara's mother's painting had hung for 20 years. The study door was open, and Clara could hear her father's voice, sharp with stress and something that might have been fear. "The railroad contracts alone are worth $50,000, he was saying. "If we can transfer them to a holding company in San Antonio—" "Richard, darling, you're overthinking this." Victoria's voice was smooth and confident. "Your daughter has no legal training, no business experience. Even if she tries to make trouble, who's going to believe a girl over an established rancher like yourself?" Clara stepped into the doorway, and both conversations stopped abruptly. Her father looked up from a stack of legal documents, his face flushing red when he saw her. "What are you doing here? I thought I made myself clear yesterday." "You did," Clara replied calmly, moving to the leather chair that had been her grandmother's favorite. "You made it very clear that you consider me no longer part of this family. I'm here to discuss the implications of that decision." Victoria rose from behind the massive oak desk, her silk morning dress rustling as she moved to stand beside Richard. "There's nothing to discuss, dear. You were told to leave, and frankly, your presence here is quite inappropriate." Clara opened her reticule and withdrew the folded document, placing it carefully on the desk. "I think you'll find my presence is entirely appropriate. In fact, I believe I'm the only person here with the legal right to be in this room." Richard's face went pale as he recognized his mother's handwriting. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the paper and read it, Victoria looking over his shoulder with growing alarm. This can't be legal," he stammered. "Mother never mentioned—" "Ooh, Grandmother was very specific about when I should present this," Clara said, settling back in the chair with a composure that surprised even her. "She said I would know when the time was right. Yesterday, you made it very clear that the time has come." Victoria snatched the document from Richard's hands, her eyes scanning the words with the calculation of someone who understood exactly what they meant. "This is 15 years old. There's no way to verify." "Actually, there is." Clara's smile was serene. "The original is filed with the land office in Austin, and Judge Morrison has already confirmed its validity. County Clerk Williams will be here within the hour to oversee the transfer of deeds and titles." The silence that followed was profound. Through the window, Clara could hear the ordinary sounds of ranch life continuing. Cattle lowing in the distance, the creek babbling through the cottonwoods, the wind moving through the grass. Life would go on, but everything was about to change. Richard sank into his chair, looking older than his 50 years. "Clara, you don't understand the complexities of running a ranch this size. The debts, the obligations, the railroad contracts." "I understand them perfectly, Papa," Clara said, using the childhood name deliberately. "I also understand that half of those debts were incurred without legal authority, and many of the contracts were signed by someone who didn't actually own the property in question." Victoria's composure finally cracked. "You little witch! You planned this whole thing, didn't you? The wedding, the dramatics, all of it just to humiliate us." Clara stood up, feeling her grandmother's strength flowing through her like water through parched ground. "I planned nothing except to marry a good man and live a quiet life. You and Papa orchestrated this confrontation. I'm simply ensuring it has the ending Grandmother intended." As if summoned by her words, the sound of horses and a wagon came from the front yard. Through the window, Clara could see Judge Morrison's familiar black buggy, followed by Thomas on horseback and several other men from town. "That will be the county officials," Clara said, moving toward the door. "I suggest you both prepare yourselves for a very interesting conversation about land ownership, fraudulent contracts, and the legal definition of inheritance." Judge Morrison was a stern man in his 60s, with silver whiskers and the bearing of someone who had spent 40 years interpreting law on the frontier. Behind him came County Clerk Williams, Dr. Patterson, and to Clara's surprise, Attorney Samuel Pierce from the territorial capital. The sight of so many official faces gathering in the Bennett parlor sent a clear message. This was not a family dispute that could be settled with harsh words and hurt feelings. Thomas stood beside Clara, his deputy sheriff badge catching the morning light as he made introductions. She'd married a good man, Clara realized, watching how he commanded respect from the assembled officials without ever raising his voice or making threats. "Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Morrison said formally, using Clara's new married name, "your husband has presented some very serious allegations regarding the ownership of this property. Before we proceed, I want to ensure everyone understands the gravity of the situation." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Victoria maintained her icy composure from behind the desk. Clara noticed she'd positioned herself to look like the rightful mistress of the house, but there was tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there an hour ago. "Judge Morrison," Richard began, "this is clearly a family matter that doesn't require—" "With respect, Mr. Bennett," the judge interrupted, "fraudulent property ownership is a territorial matter, not a family one. Mr. Pierce here represents the land office in Austin, and he's brought some very interesting information." Attorney Pierce stepped forward, opening a leather satchel and withdrawing several official documents. He was younger than Clara had expected, maybe 35, with the keen eyes of someone who'd built his reputation on attention to detail. "I've spent the last month reviewing all filings related to the Bennett Ranch," Pierce announced, spreading papers across the coffee table. "Mrs. Whitmore's husband contacted our office 6 weeks ago with questions about inheritance law, which prompted a thorough investigation." Clara glanced at Thomas in surprise. He'd been researching her grandmother's will for weeks without telling her, probably suspecting something wasn't right about her father's sudden hostility and rush to remarry. "What we discovered," Pierce continued, "is quite remarkable. Elizabeth Bennett's will was properly filed, witnessed and recorded. However, Richard Bennett has been operating under power of attorney documentation that expired 5 years ago, upon his mother's death." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Victoria's facade finally cracked, her face going pale as the implications became clear. "That's impossible," she said sharply. "Richard inherited everything when his mother died. The ranch, the cattle, all of it." Dr. Patterson, who'd been standing quietly near the window, cleared his throat. "I'm afraid that's not correct, Mrs. Bennett. I was present when Elizabeth made her will, and I can testify to her specific concerns about her son's financial decisions following his wife's death." Richard's face flushed red. "My mother was an old woman who didn't understand modern ranching. The investments I made lost nearly half the herd to poor management," Clara interrupted, her voice steady but sharp. "Grandmother told me about the cattle that died during the winter of '82 because you sold the winter feed to pay gambling debts in San Antonio." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room knew about Richard's periodic trips to the city, but the extent of his gambling had been family business. Until now. Judge Morrison consulted his notes, his weathered face grave. "Mr. Bennett, according to these records, you've mortgaged portions of the ranch to the railroad company, sold mineral rights to a mining consortium, and transferred water rights to the Territorial Irrigation Authority. All of this was done under the assumption that you owned the property." "I do own it!" Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. I've worked this land for 30 years, built it up from nothing after the war. You worked it under your mother's ownership, County Clerk Williams corrected, consulting his own documents. And according to the terms of her will, all improvements made to the property belong to the true heir, not the person who happened to be managing it. Clara felt the weight of 3 generations of Bennett women settling on her shoulders. Her great-grandmother had homesteaded this land in the 1840s. Her grandmother had held it through the Civil War and Reconstruction, and now it fell to her to protect it from the very family that should have been its guardian. "There's more," Attorney Pierce said, his voice grave. "The mortgage payments, Mr. Bennett arranged with the railroad company are 3 months behind. The mining consortium is threatening legal action over mineral rights they believe they purchased legitimately, and the territorial government is demanding immediate payment for water rights that may have been sold illegally." Victoria finally spoke, her voice like ice cracking. "How much money are we talking about?" "Including penalties and interest, nearly $200,000. The figure hit the room like a thunderclap. It was more money than most people in Texas would see in 5 lifetimes, enough to buy half the county. Clara felt her knees go weak, but Thomas's steady hand on her back kept her upright. "However," Pierce continued, "since these contracts were executed by someone without legal authority to sell the assets in question, they may all be null and void. The true owner has the right to challenge every transaction." Richard sank back into his chair, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "Clara, you don't understand. If you challenge those contracts, you'll be fighting the railroad company, the mining consortium, and the territorial government all at once. They'll destroy you in court." "Maybe," Clara said quietly, "but they'll be fighting the rightful owner of the land, not someone who's been operating under false pretenses for 5 years. Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. "You vindictive little witch, you'd rather see this ranch destroyed than let your father keep what he's worked for his entire life." "I'd rather see it protected by someone who actually has the legal right to make decisions about its future," Clara replied, "and who won't gamble away its resources or mortgage its future to pay for expensive wives." The insult hit home. Victoria stood up abruptly, her silk dress rustling with indignation. "Richard, tell them about the railroad contract, about how much money we stand to make when the new line comes through." Judge Morrison looked up sharply. "What railroad contract?" Richard's face went pale. "Victoria, don't. The contract Richard signed last month," Victoria continued, too angry to notice her husband's warning signals. "The railroad company is paying $50,000 for right-of-way access through the eastern section of the ranch. We used that money to pay for the wedding and other expenses." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what Victoria had just revealed. "Mr. Bennett," Attorney Pierce said slowly, "are you telling us that you accepted payment for property access based on forged ownership documents?" "It wasn't forged," Richard said weakly. "I believed I had the right." "Belief doesn't constitute legal ownership," Judge Morrison interrupted. "And accepting money for property you don't own is fraud, criminal fraud." Thomas stepped forward, his hand resting on his service revolver. "Mr. Bennett, I'm going to need you to accompany me to the county jail while we sort this out." "Richard!" Victoria's scream echoed through the house. "Do something, fight back!" But the fight had gone out of Richard Bennett. He looked at his daughter with something that might have been regret, then at his wife with something that definitely was. "Clara, I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting the ranch, making it stronger." "You were protecting your pride, Papa," Clara said softly. "And look where it's brought us." As Thomas led her father toward the door, Victoria made one last desperate play. "The ranch won't survive this scandal, you know. No one will do business with the Bennett name after today. You'll lose everything anyway." Clara looked around the parlor where she'd played as a child, where her mother had taught her to embroider, where her grandmother had told her stories about the early days of Texas. The weight of inheritance wasn't just about land and money. It was about legacy, about protecting something that had been built with blood and sweat and love. "Maybe," Clara said, her voice stronger than she felt, "but I'll lose it as its rightful owner, making my own decisions. And if I can save it, I'll save it the right way." As the officials filed out of the house, Clara stood alone in the parlor with Victoria. The woman who had orchestrated her public humiliation less than 24 hours ago now looked small and desperate, her expensive clothes unable to hide the collapse of all her carefully laid plans. "This isn't over," Victoria said, her voice shaking with rage. "I'll fight you. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of vindictive, ungrateful daughter you really are." Clara walked to the window and looked out over the land that was truly hers for the first time. The afternoon sun painted the grassland gold, and somewhere in the distance she could hear cattle calling to each other across the range. "Fight me all you want," she said without turning around. "But do it from somewhere else. You have until sunset to pack your things and leave. After that, you'll be trespassing on my property." The sound of Victoria's heels clicking rapidly across the wooden floor was the last Clara heard of her stepmother. By evening, both she and Richard's belongings would be gone, loaded into a wagon bound for San Antonio and an uncertain future. Clara remained at the window until Thomas returned, watching the shadows lengthen across the land her grandmother had protected for her. The real work was just beginning, sorting out the legal mess, fighting the corporations, and learning to run a ranch that was larger and more complex than she'd ever imagined. But for the first time since her wedding day, Clara felt truly at peace. The land had chosen its keeper, just as Grandmother Elizabeth had promised. Now it was up to Clara to prove herself worthy of the choice. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Clara stood in the ranch office at dawn, surrounded by ledgers, legal documents, and correspondence that painted a picture of systematic mismanagement. Thomas had moved his few belongings to the main house, but they both understood that the simple cabin would always be their real home. This grand house was merely the administrative center of a business empire that Clara was still learning to navigate. Maria Santos knocked softly on the doorframe, carrying a tray with strong coffee and fresh biscuits. "Mija, you have been up all night again. This is not good for your health." Clara accepted the coffee gratefully, her eyes burning from reading by lamplight. "Maria, look at this." She spread out a map of the ranch marked with colored pencils to show the various parcels that had been mortgaged, sold, or leased. Papa sold the mineral rights to the entire northern section for less than half what they're worth. And this water rights contract, she shook her head in dismay. He essentially gave away control of the Rio Grande access for 20 years. Maria studied the map with the practical wisdom of someone who had watched 3 generations of Bennetts work this land. "Your grandmother, she always said the land would take care of itself if we took care of it. But your father, after your mother died, he stopped listening to the land." Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the window. A fancy black carriage with gold trim was making its way up the long drive, followed by several mounted men in expensive suits. She recognized the railroad company's colors immediately. "It seems our first real test has arrived," Clara murmured, checking her appearance in the mirror. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a practical riding skirt and jacket in deep brown, with her hair pinned up severely and her grandmother's silver jewelry as the only ornamentation. She wanted to look competent and professional, not like a young woman who could be intimidated. Thomas appeared in the doorway, still wearing his deputy sheriff badge. "The railroad men are here, along with someone from the Territorial Land Office and what looks like a lawyer from Austin. Should I stay for the meeting?" Clara considered the question carefully. Having her husband present would demonstrate that she had support, but it might also suggest that she couldn't handle business matters independently. In 1887 Texas, a woman's competence was always in question, regardless of her legal rights. "Stay nearby, but let me handle the initial conversation," she decided. If they start making threats or getting aggressive, then we'll reassess. The delegation that assembled in the parlor was formidable. Railroad Vice President Cornelius Murphy was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the confident air of someone accustomed to getting his way. Beside him sat attorney Harrison Webb from Austin, whose reputation for ruthless corporate litigation was well known throughout Texas. The third man introduced himself as James Crawford from the Territorial Land Office, a thin, nervous-looking bureaucrat who kept checking his pocket watch. "Mrs. Whitmore," Murphy began, his voice carrying the slight accent of old money Boston, "I trust you understand why we're here. Your father entered into a legally binding contract with the Texas and Rio Grande Railroad Company. We've already made substantial investments based on that agreement." Clara settled into her grandmother's chair, projecting a calm she didn't entirely feel. "I understand you believe you have a valid contract, Mr. Murphy. However, my legal advisors have informed me that contracts signed by someone without proper authority are generally not enforceable." Attorney Webb leaned forward, his cold eyes assessing Clara like a predator sizing up prey. "Mrs. Whitmore, with all due respect, this is a very complex area of law. Perhaps it would be better if your husband or another male relative handled these negotiations." The dismissive tone hit Clara like a slap, but she'd been expecting it. This was exactly the kind of attitude that had allowed her father to make disastrous decisions without challenge. The assumption that any man's judgment was superior to a woman's, regardless of the facts. "My husband is a deputy sheriff, Mr. Webb, not a rancher. I, on the other hand, have lived on this land for 23 years and understand every aspect of its operation. I believe I'm the most qualified person to discuss its future." Murphy's face reddened slightly. "Young lady, the railroad company has already spent $15,000 on surveying and preliminary construction based on our agreement with your father. If you attempt to void that contract, we'll sue you for damages that will bankrupt this ranch permanently." Clara had been dreading this moment, but now that it was here, she felt oddly calm. "Mr. Murphy, let me ask you a question. When your company enters into contracts for millions of dollars, do you verify that the person signing actually has the authority to do so?" "Of course we do," Murphy replied stiffly. "Then you have documentation proving that Richard Bennett owned the property in question." Webb and Murphy exchanged glances. Crawford from the land office shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly very interested in his pocket watch. "The Bennett name has been associated with this ranch for decades," Webb said carefully. "Any reasonable person would assume—" "Assumptions aren't legal documentation," Clara interrupted. "Did you or did you not verify ownership before accepting his signature?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Clara opened a folder on the table beside her and withdrew a copy of her grandmother's will, along with the certificate from the Austin Land Office confirming its validity. This document clearly states that Elizabeth Bennett bequeathed the entire ranch to me, effective on my 23rd birthday or wedding day, whichever came first. It was properly filed, witnessed, and recorded. Your contract was signed by someone who had no legal authority to grant railroad access to property he didn't own. Murphy's face had progressed from red to purple. "This is preposterous. We have a signed contract." "You have a piece of paper signed by a man who was essentially a squatter," Clara said firmly. "The question now is whether you want to work with the actual property owner to reach a mutually beneficial agreement, or whether you prefer to continue threatening someone whose legal position is significantly stronger than yours." The tactical shift caught all three men off guard. Instead of the frightened young woman they'd expected to intimidate, they were facing someone who understood both the law and the practical realities of their situation. Crawford finally spoke up, his voice thin and worried. "Mrs. Whitmore, if what you're saying is true, then the territorial government also has contracts with Mr. Bennett that may be invalid. The water rights agreement alone involves $17,000 in annual payments. I'm aware of that, Mr. Crawford. I'm also aware that the territorial government has a choice. They can work with me to establish new agreements that actually have legal standing, or they can continue trying to enforce contracts with someone who never had the authority to sign them. Webb pulled out a thick legal folder and began spreading documents across the coffee table. Mrs. Whitmore, even if we accept your claim to ownership, you're still bound by the principle of good faith negotiations. Your father acted as your agent. My father acted without my knowledge or consent, Clara interrupted. Furthermore, he used the proceeds from your illegal contract to pay gambling debts and finance a wedding, demonstrating that he was not acting in the property's best interests. The revelation about gambling debts hit the room like a thunderclap. Corporate lawyers understood the implications immediately. If Richard Bennett had been selling assets to cover personal debts, it raised serious questions about fraud and misrepresentation. Murphy stood up abruptly, his patience clearly exhausted. Young lady, the railroad company is not accustomed to having our contracts challenged by amateurs. We have lawyers, we have territorial connections, and we have the resources to make this very expensive for you. Clara rose to meet his gaze, feeling her grandmother's strength flowing through her. Mr. Murphy, let me explain something about this ranch that your preliminary surveys might have missed. The eastern section where you want to build your tracks, it includes the primary water source for the entire county. The mineral rights you think my father sold? They include a limestone quarry that your company will need for construction materials. The grazing rights you're planning to disrupt? They support the largest cattle operation between here and San Antonio. She moved to the window and gestured toward the vast expanse of rangeland. You can fight me in court if you want, but while you're doing that, every other railroad company in Texas will be learning that the Rio Grande access they need is controlled by someone who understands exactly what it's worth. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. In the rapidly expanding railroad industry, access to water and materials could make the difference between a profitable line and a financial disaster. Clara was offering cooperation, but she was also demonstrating that she had the power to make their project very difficult if they chose confrontation over negotiation. Webb cleared his throat. What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Whitmore? Clara returned to her chair, pulling out a folder she'd prepared the night before. New contracts, properly executed with the legal property owner. Fair compensation based on current market values, not the below-market rates my father accepted. Shared water rights that protect both the railroad's needs and the ranch's operations. And most importantly, consultation on any decisions that affect the land's long-term viability. Murphy studied the proposal, his business instincts warring with his wounded pride. These rates are nearly double what we agreed to pay your father. These rates reflect the true value of what you're asking for, Clara replied calmly. My father was either ignorant of that value or desperate enough to accept less than fair compensation. I am neither. The three men huddled in conference for several minutes, their voices too low for Clara to hear clearly. Finally, Webb spoke for the group. We'll need to review these proposals with our respective organizations, Mrs. Whitmore. This isn't the kind of decision that can be made in a single meeting. I understand completely, Clara said, rising to signal the end of the conversation. Take all the time you need, but understand that every day you delay gives my legal team more time to research exactly how much damage your invalid contracts may have caused to the ranch's value. As the delegation filed out to their carriage, Thomas appeared in the doorway. How did it go? Clara sank back into her chair, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of 2 weeks of 18-hour days. Better than I expected. They came here to intimidate a helpless widow, and instead they found a business owner who's done her homework. And now? Now we wait to see whether they're smart enough to negotiate or proud enough to fight. Clara looked out the window as the black carriage disappeared down the dusty road. Either way, Grandmother Elizabeth would be proud. The land is finally being protected by someone who understands its true worth. 3 days later, Clara's prediction proved accurate when Attorney Webb returned, not with the railroad delegation, but with a federal marshal and a court order demanding immediate access to all ranch records and financial documents. The legal escalation was swift and brutal, designed to overwhelm a small-town operation with the full weight of corporate legal machinery. Clara met them at the front door, dressed in her best black dress, with her grandmother's pearl brooch as armor against intimidation. Thomas stood beside her in his deputy sheriff uniform, his hand resting casually on his service revolver. "Marshal Thompson," Clara said formally, recognizing the federal officer from territorial business in town. "I assume this isn't a social call." Thompson was a fair man in his 40s, who'd earned respect throughout West Texas for his even-handed enforcement of territorial law. He looked uncomfortable as he handed Clara the legal documents. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry about this, but I'm required to serve this court order. The railroad company has filed a federal complaint alleging fraud and breach of contract. They're claiming your father's agreements were made in good faith and that you're attempting to void legitimate business contracts through spurious inheritance claims." Clara scanned the documents quickly, her heart sinking as she recognized the scope of the legal attack. They weren't just challenging her ownership of the ranch. They were claiming that she and Thomas had conspired to defraud multiple corporations through false documentation. "This is preposterous," Thomas said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Clara's inheritance is properly documented and filed with the Territorial Land Office." Webb stepped forward with the satisfied smile of a predator who'd found wounded prey. "Mr. Whitmore, federal investigators have discovered some very interesting discrepancies in the documentation your wife has provided. We have reason to believe the will in question may have been altered or backdated to support fraudulent claims." The accusation hit Clara like a physical blow. They were challenging not just her legal right to the ranch, but her grandmother's integrity and memory. It was a calculated insult designed to provoke an emotional response that could be used against her in court. "Mr. Webb," Clara said, her voice dangerously quiet, "are you suggesting that my grandmother, the county clerk, and the town doctor all conspired to create false documents 15 years ago in anticipation of a legal dispute that wouldn't arise until after her death?" "I'm suggesting that desperate people sometimes take desperate measures," Webb replied smoothly, "and that the federal courts will require much more stringent proof of ownership than a territorial judge might accept." Marshal Thompson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have to execute this search warrant. You can cooperate voluntarily, or I can bring in additional federal agents to conduct a more thorough investigation." Clara stepped aside, gesturing toward the ranch office. "By all means, Marshal. You'll find all the ranch records exactly as my father left them. Perhaps Mr. Webb's investigation will reveal just how thoroughly my property was mismanaged while it was under unauthorized control." What followed was 6 hours of methodical destruction disguised as legal investigation. Federal agents went through every document, every ledger, every piece of correspondence related to the ranch's operation. They removed cartloads of papers, claiming they needed to verify the authenticity of various records and agreements. But they also made a crucial mistake. In their eagerness to find evidence of fraud, they photographed and catalogued everything, including documents that Clara herself hadn't had time to review thoroughly. When Thomas pointed this out quietly, Clara began to understand that the railroad company's aggressive tactics might have given her access to information they'd never intended to share. As the federal agents loaded their wagons, Webb made one final attempt at intimidation. "Mrs. Whitmore, I hope you understand the seriousness of your situation. Federal fraud charges carry prison sentences, not just financial penalties. It might be wise to consider accepting a reasonable settlement rather than continuing this charade." Damn. Clara looked at the man who thought he could destroy her grandmother's legacy with threats and legal paperwork. Mr. Webb, I hope you understand something as well. My family has been protecting this land for 40 years. We've survived droughts, cattle rustlers, Comanche raids, and the Civil War. We're not going to be intimidated by a railroad company that's too lazy to verify ownership before signing contracts. That evening, Clara and Thomas sat in their small cabin, sharing a simple dinner and trying to process the day's events. The federal investigation had been humiliating and invasive, but it had also revealed something important. The railroad company was worried enough about their legal position to risk a very public federal case. They wouldn't have escalated this far if they were confident about winning, Thomas observed, cutting a piece of Maria's cornbread. Federal courts don't like being used to settle business disputes that should be handled at the territorial level. Clara nodded, but her mind was on the documents the federal agents had catalogued. Thomas, did you see the correspondence they photographed from Papa's desk? Some of those letters were from the mining consortium, and they looked angry. Angry how? Angry like they'd been promised things that weren't delivered. There was one letter dated just 2 weeks ago that mentioned failure to provide agreed-upon mineral surveys and breach of preliminary agreements. Thomas set down his fork, understanding the implications immediately. You think your father was selling the same assets to multiple buyers? I think Papa was so desperate to pay his debts that he was making promises he couldn't keep to anyone willing to give him money. Clara pulled out a notebook where she'd been tracking the various contracts and agreements. Look at the timeline. He mortgaged the eastern section to the railroad in January, sold mineral rights to the same area to the mining consortium in March, and then leased grazing rights to the Territorial Cattle Commission in April. That's the same piece of land sold 3 different ways, Thomas said slowly, to 3 different buyers, none of whom knew about the others. Clara felt a grim satisfaction settling in her chest. Mr. Webb thinks he's investigating me for fraud, but what he's actually going to discover is that his own client entered into contracts based on forged ownership claims. The next morning brought unexpected visitors in the form of James Crawford from the Territorial Land Office, accompanied by a woman Clara didn't recognize. Crawford looked even more nervous than during his previous visit, constantly checking his pocket watch and mopping his forehead with a handkerchief, despite the cool morning air. Mrs. Whitmore, Crawford began hesitantly, I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell from the Territorial Attorney General's office. She has some questions about the federal investigation. Sarah Mitchell was a surprise. A woman in her 30s wearing a practical traveling dress and carrying a leather satchel that marked her as a professional. Clara had never met a female attorney before, though she'd heard they existed in some of the larger territorial cities. Mrs. Whitmore, Mitchell said, shaking hands with a firm grip, I'm here because the territorial government is concerned about the implications of the federal investigation. If the contracts your father signed are invalid, it creates problems that extend far beyond your ranch. Clara invited them into the parlor, noting that both visitors declined Maria's offer of coffee. Whatever they were here to discuss, they wanted to keep it brief and formal. What kind of problems? Clara asked. Mitchell consulted her notes before answering. If a property owner can sign multiple conflicting contracts for the same assets, and if those contracts can be enforced even when the signer lacks legal authority, it creates a precedent that could invalidate property rights throughout the territory. The implications hit Clara immediately. The territorial government wasn't just concerned about her ranch, they were worried about the precedent the federal case might set for property law throughout the region. In other words, Clara said slowly, if the railroad company wins this case, it could mean that anyone who manages property for someone else can sell it permanently, regardless of the actual owner's wishes. Exactly, Mitchell replied, and that would essentially eliminate inheritance rights, family trusts, and most forms of estate planning throughout Texas. Crawford shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mrs. Whitmore, the territorial government would like to offer you full legal support in fighting the federal charges. We have resources and expertise that could be very helpful in your defense. Clara studied both visitors carefully. The territorial government's support would be invaluable, but she suspected it came with conditions. What would you want in return? Mitchell smiled slightly, the first expression of approval Clara had seen from her. Direct honesty. I appreciate that. In return for our legal support, we'd want assurance that any new contracts you negotiate will respect both territorial law and establish precedents for property rights. And we'd want you to testify as a territorial witness regarding the specific ways your father's unauthorized contracts violated established property law. Clara realized what they were asking. They wanted her to help establish a legal precedent that would protect property rights throughout the territory, using her case as the foundation. It was exactly the kind of fight her grandmother would have supported, protecting not just her own land, but the principle that land ownership meant something. I accept, Clara said without hesitation, but I have conditions of my own. Both visitors leaned forward attentively. First, any support you provide must respect my authority as the legal property owner. I won't accept being protected if it means having my decisions second-guessed by territorial bureaucrats. Mitchell nodded approvingly. Agreed. Second, I want full disclosure about any other cases where similar issues have arisen. If this is a pattern, I want to know about it. Crawford looked uncomfortable, but Mitchell answered immediately. There have been at least 6 similar cases in the last 2 years, all involving family property that was sold or mortgaged by relatives without proper authority. Yours is the first where the true owner has had both the legal documentation and the resources to fight back effectively. And third, Clara continued, when this is over, I want help establishing new territorial guidelines for property ownership verification. What happened to my family shouldn't be able to happen to anyone else. Mitchell extended her hand again, this time with genuine respect. Mrs. Whitmore, I think we're going to work very well together. As the territorial officials left, Clara felt a fundamental shift in her understanding of the situation. This wasn't just about her ranch anymore. It was about protecting the principle of property ownership for everyone in Texas. The railroad company had picked the wrong woman to intimidate, and now they were about to face not just a determined rancher, but the full legal authority of the territorial government. The land had chosen its keeper, and Clara was finally beginning to understand the full scope of what that meant. The federal trial was scheduled for Austin in early October, just 2 weeks after the first frost had touched the grass on the Bennett Ranch. Clara made the journey by train, accompanied by Thomas and Sarah Mitchell from the Territorial Attorney General's office. As they traveled east across the familiar landscape of Texas, Clara felt the weight of 3 generations of Bennett women settling on her shoulders. The federal courthouse in Austin was imposing, a massive stone building that represented the full authority of the United States government. Clara had never been inside a federal courtroom before, and the formality was intimidating. But as she took her seat at the defendant's table, she reminded herself that she was fighting for more than just her own property rights. Federal Judge Hamilton Reeves presided over the case with the stern authority of someone who had spent 30 years interpreting law on the frontier. He was known for his fairness, but also for his impatience with legal theatrics, a reputation that seemed to favor Clara's straightforward approach over the railroad company's elaborate accusations. Attorney Webb led the prosecution with a team of corporate lawyers who had traveled from Chicago specifically for this case. Their opening statement was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, painting Clara as a desperate young woman who had conspired with her husband to forge inheritance documents and defraud legitimate businesses. Your Honor, Webb declared in his closing remarks, the defendants want this court to believe that a simple frontier woman somehow orchestrated a complex legal scheme involving falsified documents, backdated wills, and coordinated testimony from multiple witnesses. The sheer sophistication of this alleged fraud demonstrates that we are dealing with criminal minds of considerable cunning. Clara listened to her character being assassinated with quiet dignity, but she felt her temper rising as Webb implied that her grandmother had been party to a decades-long conspiracy. When Sarah Mitchell rose to deliver the defense opening statement, Clara was ready for war. "Your Honor," Mitchell began, "the prosecution would have you believe that Elizabeth Bennet, a respected rancher and pillar of her community, spent the final years of her life creating elaborate false documents to benefit a granddaughter who was barely 15 years old. They want you to believe that the county clerk, the town doctor, and the territorial land office all participated in this conspiracy. But what they cannot explain is why a woman would commit fraud to benefit someone who wouldn't inherit anything for 8 years, and might never inherit at all if she died young or chose not to marry." The logic was devastating. Clara felt a surge of hope as she watched the federal prosecutor's table exchange worried glances. Mitchell continued, "What the evidence will show is that Richard Bennet, motivated by gambling debts and financial desperation, systematically sold assets he didn't own to multiple buyers who failed to verify his authority. The real fraud in this case was perpetrated by Mr. Bennet against the corporations who are now suing his daughter." The prosecution's first witness was Richard Bennet himself, brought from the San Antonio jail where he was awaiting trial on territorial fraud charges. Clara's heart broke a little as she watched her father take the stand, looking older and more defeated than she'd ever seen him. Webb's questioning was designed to paint Richard as a victim of his daughter's manipulation, but Richard's answers were hesitant and inconsistent. When Sarah Mitchell began cross-examination, the real story finally emerged. "Mr. Bennet," Mitchell said firmly, "when did you first become aware of your mother's will?" I knew she had made one, but I never read it carefully." Did you consult an attorney before signing contracts on behalf of the ranch?" "No, I assumed that since I'd been managing the property, I had the authority to make decisions." "Did you inform any of the contracting parties that you might not have clear title to the property?" Richard's voice was barely audible. "No." "Mr. Bennet, is it true that you used money from the railroad contract to pay gambling debts in San Antonio?" The question hung in the air like a gunshot. Richard looked across the courtroom at Clara, his eyes filled with shame and regret. "Yes," he whispered. The admission sent a ripple through the courtroom. Webb objected strenuously, but the damage was done. Richard Bennet had just admitted under oath that he had used fraudulently obtained money to pay personal debts. Mitchell's next witness was Dr. Patterson, who testified about Elizabeth Bennet's mental state when she made her will. His testimony was clear and unshakable. Elizabeth had been lucid, determined, and very specific about her concerns regarding her son's financial judgment. "Mrs. Bennet told me explicitly that she was worried about Richard's gambling and his tendency to make impulsive business decisions," Dr. Patterson testified. "She said the land needed to be protected from well-meaning fools and expensive wives." The phrase drew laughter from the courtroom gallery, but Judge Reeves quickly restored order. Clara noticed that several members of the jury were nodding in approval. They understood the kind of wisdom that came from frontier women who had spent their lives protecting family property. County Clerk Williams was equally effective, producing the original will from the Territorial Land Office files and walking the jury through the proper procedures for recording such documents. His testimony established beyond doubt that Elizabeth Bennet's will was legitimate, properly filed, and legally binding. But the real bombshell came when Sarah Mitchell called her final witness, James Crawford from the Territorial Land Office, armed with a complete investigation of all contracts signed by Richard Bennet over the past 5 years. "Mr. Crawford," Mitchell said, "what did your investigation reveal about the contracts Mr. Bennet signed with various corporations?" Crawford consulted his notes nervously. We discovered that Mr. Bennett sold or mortgaged the same pieces of property multiple times to different buyers. The eastern section of the ranch, for example, was mortgaged to the railroad company, sold for mineral rights to a mining consortium, and leased for grazing rights to a cattle operation. All for the same piece of land? Yes, ma'am. And none of the buyers were informed about the other contracts. Webb objected repeatedly, but Judge Reeves allowed the testimony to continue. Crawford's investigation had revealed a pattern of fraudulent contracts that extended far beyond Clara's ranch. Richard Bennett had been systematically selling assets he didn't own to anyone willing to pay cash up front. Mr. Crawford, Mitchell continued, in your professional opinion, did Mr. Bennett have the legal authority to sign any of these contracts? No, ma'am. According to the properly filed will of Elizabeth Bennett, all authority over the property transferred to Clara Bennett upon her 23rd birthday or marriage, whichever came first. Any contracts signed after that date were invalid. The prosecution's case was crumbling, but Webb made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. His closing argument focused on the complexity of frontier property law and the reasonable expectations of corporations doing business in good faith. Your Honor, Webb argued, even if we accept that Richard Bennett lacked legal authority, the corporations involved had no way of knowing that. They relied on 40 years of Bennett family management and the reasonable assumption that the person controlling the property had the right to make decisions about it. It was a sophisticated legal argument, but it ran headlong into the fundamental principle of property law. You cannot sell what you do not own, regardless of appearances or assumptions. Mitchell's closing was devastating in its simplicity. Your Honor, the law is clear. Property ownership requires legal documentation, not assumption. The corporations suing Mrs. Whitmore failed to perform due diligence before entering into major contracts. They cannot now claim fraud simply because they discovered their own negligence. Judge Reeves deliberated for less than an hour before returning with his verdict. Clara held Thomas's hand tightly as the judge prepared to speak, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just her future, but the future of property law throughout Texas. In the matter of Texas and Rio Grande Railroad Company versus Clara Whitmore, Judge Reeves announced, I find that the defendant's ownership of the Bennett Ranch is legally valid and properly documented. All contracts signed by Richard Bennett after the effective date of Elizabeth Bennett's will are null and void due to lack of legal authority. The courtroom erupted in celebration from Clara's supporters and angry protests from the corporate representatives. But Judge Reeves wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, this case highlights a disturbing pattern of corporate negligence in verifying property ownership. I am recommending that the territorial government establish mandatory verification procedures for all property transactions exceeding $1,000 in value. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as Thomas pulled her into his arms. They had won not just the legal battle, but the larger war for property rights throughout Texas. Her grandmother's wisdom had protected not just the Bennett Ranch, but the principle that land ownership meant something real and permanent. As they left the courthouse, Sarah Mitchell pulled Clara aside with a final surprise. Mrs. Whitmore, the territorial government would like to offer you a position developing those new property verification procedures Judge Reeves recommended. Interested in helping write the laws that will protect other families from what happened to yours? Clara looked back at the imposing federal courthouse, then west toward the land that had shaped her life and tested her courage. Miss Mitchell, I think Grandmother Elizabeth would approve. The land chose its keeper, and now it's time for the keeper to protect other people's land as well. 6 months later, Clara stood on the front porch of the Bennett Ranch main house, watching the sun rise over land that was finally, unquestionably hers. The federal trial had ended the legal challenges, but the real work of rebuilding had only just begun. The ranch was debt-free for the first time in 5 years, but it also needed new contracts, new business relationships, and most importantly, new leadership that could restore confidence in the Bennett name. Thomas joined her on the porch, carrying 2 cups of Maria's strong coffee and the morning mail from town. His deputy sheriff badge caught the early light as he settled into the chair beside hers. A reminder that their life together bridged 2 worlds, law enforcement and ranching. "Letter from Sarah Mitchell," Thomas said, handing her an official envelope from the Territorial Attorney General's office, "and one from the railroad company that looks important." Clara opened Mitchell's letter first, scanning the formal language with the practiced eye of someone who had become fluent in legal documentation over the past months. The news was better than she'd hoped. The territorial legislature approved the new property verification laws, she announced, unable to keep the satisfaction from her voice. "Every property transaction over $1,000 now requires verification of ownership through the Territorial Land Office, and they want me to oversee the implementation." Thomas whistled softly. From disowned daughter to territorial property law expert in less than a year. Your grandmother would be proud. The railroad letter was equally satisfying, though in a different way. Vice President Murphy, who had tried to intimidate her 6 months earlier, was now requesting a meeting to negotiate new contracts under the court-approved guidelines. The tone was respectful, almost deferential, a dramatic change from the corporate arrogance she'd faced during the federal trial. "They want to offer premium rates for right-of-way access," Clara said, reading the proposal carefully. "Nearly 3 times what Papa originally accepted, plus guaranteed water rights and environmental protections." "Are you going to accept?" Clara considered the question while watching a hawk circle high above the eastern section where the railroad wanted to build. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, golden grass moving in waves like a vast ocean. Her great-grandmother had homesteaded this piece of Texas when it was still contested territory. Her grandmother had held it through war and Reconstruction. And now it fell to Clara to shepherd it into the modern age. "I'm going to negotiate," she decided. "But this time, the railroad is going to work with us, not against us. No more secret contracts or unauthorized sales. Everything transparent, everything legal, everything protecting the land's long-term value." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the long drive leading up to the house. A familiar wagon was making its way toward them, driven by Judge Morrison and carrying several passengers that Clara recognized from town. "Looks like we have company," Thomas observed, standing to greet the arriving delegation. Judge Morrison climbed down from his wagon with the careful movements of a man in his 70s, followed by County Clerk Williams, Dr. Patterson, and to Clara's surprise, several other ranchers from the surrounding area. She recognized John Hartwell from the Circle H Ranch, Mary Catherine O'Brien, who ran her late husband's spread single-handed, and James Sullivan, whose family had been neighbors for 20 years. "Morning, Clara," Judge Morrison said formally, removing his hat in greeting. "We're here on official business." Clara and Thomas descended the porch steps to meet their visitors, both curious and slightly worried about what kind of official business would bring so many prominent citizens to their door on a Saturday morning. "What can we do for you, Judge?" Clara asked. Judge Morrison cleared his throat and consulted a folded document. "Clara Whitmore, the citizens of Millbrook County have asked me to present you with a formal request." He unfolded the paper and began reading in his courtroom voice. "Whereas Clara Whitmore has demonstrated exceptional courage and wisdom in protecting property rights throughout our county, and whereas her legal victory has established precedents that benefit all landowners in Texas, and whereas her knowledge of both ranching and territorial law makes her uniquely qualified for public service." Clara felt her heart beginning to race as she realized what was coming. "We hereby request that Clara Whitmore accept appointment as Millbrook County's first female county commissioner with specific responsibility for property rights, land use planning, and agricultural development." The silence that followed was profound. Clara stared at the assembled delegation, trying to process what they were asking. A county commissioner position would give her authority over land use decisions throughout the entire county, not just her own ranch. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "It's your choice, but I think you'd be excellent at it." Mary Catherine O'Brien stepped forward, her weathered face serious. "Clara, I've been running my ranch alone for 3 years since my husband died. The county officials have never taken me seriously when I've brought concerns about water rights or grazing permits. Having another woman in government, especially one who understands land management, would make a real difference." John Hartwell nodded agreement. "What you did with the railroad case protected all of us. If they could have gotten away with enforcing fraudulent contracts against you, none of our property would be safe." Clara looked around at the faces of her neighbors, people who had known her since childhood, who had watched her grow up on this land, who had supported her through the darkest period of her life. They weren't just offering her a political position, they were asking her to help protect their community. "I'm honored by your confidence," Clara said slowly, "but I need to understand what this position would actually involve." Judge Morrison smiled, clearly having expected the question. "The county commissioner's job is to oversee county services, approve budgets, and make decisions about land use and development. With your experience, you'd also serve as the county's liaison to the territorial government on property law issues. And it would mean traveling to Austin regularly for territorial meetings," County Clerk Williams added. "You'd be representing our county's interests in the territorial legislature." Clara felt the weight of the opportunity settling around her. It was exactly the kind of work her grandmother would have supported, using hard-won knowledge to protect other families from the kind of betrayal she'd experienced. "I accept," she said, feeling a deep sense of rightness about the decision. "But I have conditions." Judge Morrison chuckled. "We'd be surprised if you didn't. First, I keep running the ranch. It's my primary responsibility, and I won't accept any position that requires me to neglect the land." "Agreed," Dr. Patterson said immediately. "The county commissioner position is part-time anyway. Most of the work can be done here at the ranch. Second, I want to establish a county property records office with trained staff. Too many of our problems come from poor documentation and informal agreements that can't be enforced legally." "Excellent idea," Williams said approvingly. "Long overdue." "And third," Clara continued, "I want to create a county fund to help small landowners fight legal challenges from corporations or territorial government overreach. What happened to my family shouldn't happen to anyone else, but people need resources to fight back." The assembled delegation exchanged glances, and Clara could see the approval in their faces. These were practical people who understood the value of protecting their community against outside threats. "Clara Whitmore," Judge Morrison said formally, "by the authority vested in me by the territorial government of Texas, I hereby appoint you as county commissioner for Millbrook County, effective immediately." As her neighbors applauded and congratulated her, Clara felt her grandmother's presence more strongly than ever. Elizabeth Bennet had protected this land for her family, but Clara was being called to protect it for her entire community. That evening, Clara and Thomas sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The county commissioner appointment would change their lives significantly, but Clara felt a deep sense of purpose about the work ahead. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, reaching for her hand. Clara thought about everything that had led to this moment. The betrayal at her wedding, the federal trial, the months of legal battles, and now the opportunity to use her experience to help others. It had been the most difficult year of her life, but also the most meaningful. "No regrets," she said firmly. "The land chose its keeper, and now the keeper has work to do." As if in response to her words, a gentle breeze stirred the grass around the house, carrying the familiar scents of sage and wildflowers that had perfumed her childhood. Somewhere in the distance, cattle were calling to each other across the range, and the creek that ran through the cottonwoods sang its eternal song of continuity and change. Clara Elizabeth Bennett Whitmore had been disowned at her wedding, but she had taken the land title anyway. More than that, she had transformed personal betrayal into public service, protecting not just her own inheritance, but the property rights of an entire county. The girl who had walked away from her father's house in a wedding dress had become a woman who could reshape the laws of Texas. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara made a silent promise to her grandmother's memory. The Bennett Ranch would continue to flourish under her protection, but more importantly, the principles Elizabeth Bennett had died defending, family, land, and the courage to fight for what was right, would now protect an entire community. The land had indeed chosen its keeper, and Clara was finally ready to fulfill the full scope of that calling.